Sarah Williams, a 38-year-old single mother, stood at the bustling check-in counter of JetStream Airlines with a first-class ticket in her hand. As the CEO of Fresh Farms, supply a company responsible for providing fresh, traceable food to numerous high-end airlines, she had seen her fair share of business meetings, long flights and negotiations. She was no stranger to the world of corporate power and the delicate balance between hard work and respect. Yet as she approached the counter at JFK International Airport, she was merely another passenger in the eyes of the young woman standing before her. Emily Carter, a 24-year-old gate agent who had been recently transferred to JFK from a smaller airport in Tulsa, was manning the counter with a strict focus. She scanned the faces of passengers in line, her expression neutral, almost robotic. But when Sarah Williams handed over her first-class ticket, Emily hesitated. There was a slight, almost imperceptible pause before Emily's eyes flicked down to the ticket, once again, then back up at Sarah. It wasn't a curious glance, it was a scrutinizing one that felt as though Sarah didn't belong in this space. She didn't look like the typical first-class passenger in Emily's mind, and it showed in the way she raised an eyebrow, the way her gaze lingered too long. Sarah had always been aware of how people looked at her. As a black woman who had climbed the corporate ladder against the odds, she had experienced her fair share of prejudice, but she had also learned not to react. She wasn't interested in explaining herself to anyone. Her success spoke for itself. But today, in this airport, standing in front of this gate agent, she couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. It was the same feeling she had encountered at the luxury hotel in Dallas years ago when she was mistaken for someone who wasn't important enough to be in the conference area. This time she wasn't going to be silent. This time she wouldn't back down. "Is there a problem?" Sarah asked, her voice, calm but firm. Emily's response came quickly, coldly, almost as if she had rehearsed it. "This lane is for first-class passengers, ma'am," she said. Her tone formal, yet there was something in the way she spoke that made the words sting. No smile, no warmth, just a sharp, pointed statement. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She simply replied, her voice unwavering. "I know." Her gaze never left Emily's, and in that moment, the air between them shifted. Emily looked at Sarah as if waiting for her to say something more, to apologize for being in the wrong lane, but Sarah remained silent, standing tall and unmoving, a silent challenge to the prejudice that had so easily reared its head. Emily's hesitation grew. She didn't scan the ticket. She didn't enter the information into the system. Instead, she took a moment to glance over her shoulder, her eyes darting toward the back of the counter where the security guard stood. It wasn't lost on Sarah that Emily's actions, though subtle, were signaling something far more insidious than just a check-in procedure. It was the unspoken judgment, the assumption that Sarah didn't belong in this space, this sacred first-class space. But what Emily didn't know was that Sarah wasn't just another passenger. She wasn't a woman traveling for leisure. She was the CEO of Fresh Farms Supply, a major player in JetStream Airlines' recent multi-million-dollar contract to supply fresh, high-quality meals for its first-class passengers. As Sarah stood there unbothered, she realized that this moment wasn't just about her. It was about the larger system of bias that many people like Emily had become unknowingly complicit in. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that Sarah had witnessed many times in her life, whether it was at business meetings, in luxury stores, or at the airport. This was the reality that many people, especially those from marginalized backgrounds, faced daily. And while she knew she could easily raise her voice, cause a scene, or demand compensation, Sarah wasn't interested in making noise. She had learned that true power didn't lie in loud protests. It lay in quiet, resolute actions that made people rethink their assumptions. The silence stretched on. Emily glanced back at Sarah, her fingers hovering over the scanner, but she didn't press it. She didn't want to make a mistake. The doubt in her eyes was evident, and Sarah knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't about a technical glitch. This was about perception. This was about a woman standing in front of a gate agent who had already decided, based on nothing more than a quick glance, that Sarah didn't belong in first class, But Sarah wasn't going to argue. She wasn't going to force an apology. Instead, she calmly reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Without looking at Emily, she dialed her assistant Maggie, knowing that a simple phone call would soon make everything clear. "Hi, Maggie," Sarah said, her tone calm and controlled. "Pull up the $48 million contract with JetStream Airlines, the one for the Western routes. I'm at JFK Gate 17. Looks like they need a reminder. Maggie didn't ask any questions. She knew exactly what Sarah meant. "I'm pulling it up now," she replied. "Do you want me to call Cynthia Reyes directly?" Sarah glanced over at Emily, who was now pretending to be busy with her computer screen. "Not yet." Sarah said, "Just flag it for now. I think they're about to realize the issue." And so Sarah stood there silently, knowing that one simple phone call would soon shake the entire system to its core. As the minutes passed, she watched the scene unfold around her. Passengers continued to pass by, glancing at her with curiosity. Some whispered, speculating about why she was being held up, but Sarah didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She wasn't in a hurry. She wasn't concerned with the gossip or the uncomfortable stares. She knew that sometimes standing still was the most powerful action of all. In that moment, Sarah Williams wasn't just a woman waiting to board a flight. She was a force of quiet resilience that would soon demand attention, not by raising her voice, but by making the system confront its own biases. As Sarah stood at Gate 17, her posture unwavering, the tension in the air was palpable. Emily Carter, the young gate agent, continued to hesitate, her fingers hovering over the scanner, yet she did nothing. The silence stretched, and Sarah's calm presence became more pronounced in the midst of the growing discomfort around her. The whispers from the surrounding passengers grew louder as they began to take notice of the delay. Some exchanged looks, others muttered under their breath, and a few even shook their heads as if judging her. But Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't react to the subtle snickers or the sideways glances thrown in her direction. Instead, she stood tall, her expression serene, her eyes steady. There was no anger, no frustration, just a quiet resolve that seemed to echo louder than any protest could. She had been in situations like this before, situations where the world expected her to react with emotion with a fight. But Sarah had learned long ago that true strength was not about lashing out. It was about holding your ground with composure and allowing the world to see the power in your silence. She had fought battles on bigger fronts than this, and she had learned that sometimes the most profound message was delivered without a word. She wasn't about to lose her dignity over a misunderstanding, a prejudiced assumption. This moment wasn't about Emily. It wasn't about the passengers behind her, and it certainly wasn't about the system that had failed to recognize her worth. This moment was about Sarah standing in her truth, quiet, strong, unshaken. Sarah's eyes never left Emily's, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. She had spent years in corporate meetings, negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts, walking into rooms filled with men in suits, most of whom never expected her to belong. But she had always belonged. She had built Fresh Farm Supply from the ground up, transforming it into one of the most successful clean food suppliers in the industry. And now, as she stood before Emily, she knew that nothing about her was out of place. She wasn't the one who needed to explain herself. The system that had cast a shadow of doubt over her simply because she didn't fit someone else's mold, that was the one that needed to explain itself. As Emily fumbled, still unsure of how to proceed, Sarah reached into her bag. She didn't look at the passengers who were now murmuring among themselves. She didn't acknowledge the uncomfortable looks being thrown her way. She simply pulled out her phone, unlocked it, and without hesitation dialed her executive assistant, Lily. The ringing tone on the other end of the line seemed to cut through the tension, a quiet reminder that Sarah was in control. "Hi, Lily," Sarah said, her voice as composed as ever. "Pull up the $48 million contract with JetStream Airlines, the one for supplying fresh meals for the Western routes. I'm at Gate 17 and I need it here now." Lily didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. Lily knew the gravity of the situation. She had been Sarah's assistant for years and had seen firsthand how her boss navigated challenges with a level-headed determination that left no room for doubt. "I'm pulling it up now," Lily replied. "Do you want me to call Cynthia Reyes directly?" Sarah glanced at Emily, who was now pretending to be busy with the computer screen, clearly avoiding eye contact. Sarah didn't respond to that. Instead, she replied with a calm yet deliberate tone, "Not yet. Just flag the alert for now. I think they're about to realize the issue." And with that, Sarah put the phone back into her bag, her fingers brushing over the leather surface as she stood still. Waiting around her, the murmurs continued. Some passengers had begun to stare outright, while others whispered about the delay. A few even started taking photos, their phones raised discreetly in the air, trying to capture what they assumed was a simple misunderstanding. They had no idea what was unfolding. They didn't know that the woman they were judging, the woman they were now suspicious of, wasn't just a random passenger. She was the CEO of Fresh Farm Supply, the very company responsible for transforming JetStream Airlines' in-flight meals with fresh, traceable food. But none of that mattered to the people around her. They didn't know that the food they had been eating on JetStream flights for the past few months, the meals that had received rave reviews, were all sourced from Sarah's company. They didn't know that the same woman they were silently condemning was responsible for one of the most significant contracts in the airline's recent history. All they saw was a black woman standing in front of a counter with an expensive first-class ticket. To them, Sarah didn't fit the mold of the typical first-class passenger, and that was the problem. They didn't see her as a VIP. They didn't see her as a businesswoman. They only saw the color of her skin and the suit she wore, and in their eyes, she didn't belong. But Sarah wasn't angry. She wasn't offended. She simply stood there, her gaze steady, her posture unyielding. The longer she stood there, the more the reality of the situation began to sink in. Emily's behavior wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't an isolated incident. It was the result of an unspoken prejudice that too often lurked behind the veil of procedure. Emily wasn't consciously discriminating against Sarah. She had simply followed the invisible script that society had written for her, a script that dictated who could belong in first class and who couldn't. And right now, Sarah was standing at the intersection of that prejudice and the truth. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to argue. All she had to do was wait for the moment when everything would change. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah's calmness didn't waver. She wasn't looking for validation from anyone in the airport. She didn't need anyone to apologize to her. Not yet, anyway. What she needed was for the system to recognize its flaws, to face the bias that had been built into its operations for so long. And that recognition would come not through loud protests or demands, but through the quiet strength of a woman who had learned to stand still in the face of adversity. And as she stood there with her first-class ticket still in hand, Sarah knew that this moment would make a difference. Not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been judged before they even had a chance to prove themselves. As Sarah Williams stood still at Gate 17, the weight of the situation grew heavier with each passing second. The murmurs of the surrounding passengers, the cold gaze of Emily Carter, and the hovering security guard were all signs that something far more significant was unfolding than anyone realized. Sarah, however, didn't flinch. She remained calm and composed, fully aware that the next step she took would change the course of the morning and possibly much more. With a steady hand, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, dialing Lily, her executive assistant, without hesitation. On the other end of the line, Lily answered promptly. She had been Sarah's assistant for 5 years and had become more than just someone who scheduled meetings or managed emails. She understood the gravity of the situation even before Sarah spoke. They had been through countless business challenges together, but nothing quite like this. "Hi, Lily, it's me," Sarah said, her tone still as calm as ever. "Pull up the $48 million contract with JetStream Airlines, the one for the Western routes. I need it now." Lily's response was swift. "I'm on it. Sarah, do you want me to contact Cynthia Reyes directly?" Sarah took a moment to glance around. The situation was becoming increasingly uncomfortable, but her demeanor remained unwavering. "Not yet. Just flag the alert for now. I think they're about to realize the issue," she said. She hung up the phone and slipped it back into her bag, her eyes never leaving Emily's. She didn't need to say anything else. Lily knew what to do. In seconds, Lily would pull up the contract, the one that tied JetStream Airlines to Fresh Farms Supply, and send it to the right people. The wheels of the corporate machine would soon be set in motion, and there would be no turning back. As Lily worked quickly to flag the issue, the phone lines at JetStream's headquarters started buzzing. The message had been sent, and it didn't take long before it reached the upper echelons of the airline's leadership. Rachel Stevens, the Northeast Regional Director, was one of the first to receive the alert. She was in the middle of a routine meeting when her phone buzzed with an internal notification. She glanced at the screen, her eyes immediately locking onto the words, VIP guest Celeste Williams detained at Gate 17 JFK contract with Fresh Farm Supply, 48 million. Immediate attention required. Rachel's face drained of color as she read the message again. Celeste Williams. She quickly double-checked the name. It was the same woman who had secured the largest fresh food contract JetStream had signed in years. She had been instrumental in saving the airline's reputation after the food scandals that had plagued their in-flight meals. Without her, JetStream wouldn't have been able to turn their food quality around. She was the cornerstone of their new brand image, the face of the Fresh Flight campaign. But now, here she was, being detained at Gate 17, the woman they depended on to fix their image, treated like an intruder. Rachel's mind raced, and she instinctively knew that this situation was far worse than anyone could have anticipated. This wasn't just an error, it was a crisis. As the realization set in, panic began to spread through the ranks of JetStream's executives. Cynthia Reyes, the regional director of operations, was the next to get the message. She immediately dropped everything and rushed to her office, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floors. The situation had escalated far beyond a simple mistake at the check-in counter. This was a PR disaster waiting to happen. Cynthia quickly gathered her crisis management team, including Jack Renault, the executive director of customer experience, and Elise Stonehead of brand crisis management. They would need to move fast if they hoped to prevent this from spiraling further out of control. Within minutes, the team was in full crisis mode, working frantically to get a handle on the situation. JetStream's PR team, already on high alert after their previous food quality scandal, began drafting statements, preparing for the inevitable media fallout. They had no idea yet how far-reaching this incident would be, but they could already sense the storm brewing. It wasn't just about a mistake at the counter. It wasn't just about a first-class ticket. It was about the heart of their brand. The very woman who had helped them rebuild their reputation was now being treated as if she didn't belong. Back at the airport, the tension was palpable. The longer Sarah stood there in the midst of the growing chaos, the more it became clear that the situation was rapidly escalating. The airport's operations began to slow down. Flights were delayed, and passengers who had no idea what was really happening began to get frustrated. The delay at Gate 17 was becoming a bottleneck, and soon other gates were also affected. In the internal JetStream communication system, the word delay began to appear next to every flight. At JFK, employees from security to flight attendants were instructed to pause all boarding activities. The entire airport was now caught in a state of suspended animation. The JetStream executives, who had been scrambling to assess the situation, now had to face the reality of what had happened. A woman who had been a key player in rebuilding their image was being detained not for a security reason, but because of an unconscious bias. This wasn't just about one woman. It was about the systemic problem of racial prejudice that had infiltrated the airline's culture. As the delays mounted, the internal team worked frantically to develop a response plan. Rachel Stevens quickly ordered an internal audit to review the actions of the staff involved, including the gate agent Emily Carter and the security personnel who had been called over to detain Sarah. The news spread quickly through the ranks of JetStream. In the meantime, Sarah continued to stand at Gate 17, unwavering. She didn't need to do anything. She had already made her point. She wasn't angry, and she wasn't shouting. She was simply waiting for the moment when the truth would come to light, when JetStream would be forced to confront the systemic issue at the heart of their operations. She knew that the company's internal crisis management would kick into gear, but she also knew that the truth would become undeniable once the dust settled. The phone call had been made. Now it was only a matter of time before the entire system would be forced to reckon with its mistakes. The minutes seemed to stretch on as Sarah Williams stood at gate 17, her posture as unwavering as the cold stares from the passengers surrounding her. The commotion in the airport continued, the whispers growing louder as more travelers became aware of the situation. Sarah, however, remained calm and resolute, fully aware that the wheels had been set in motion and that this was no longer about a minor misunderstanding. The silence around her was charged, but she did not allow the pressure to affect her. And then through the crowd, Rachel Stevens appeared, the Northeast Regional Director of JetStream. Airlines approached her face, betraying a mix of urgency and discomfort. Rachel had been in many crisis situations before, but nothing like this. As soon as she received the internal alert about the incident at Gate 17, she knew this wasn't just a simple check-in issue. The woman standing before her wasn't just any passenger. She was the cornerstone of the $48 million contract JetStream had signed with Fresh Farm Supply, a contract that had been crucial to their brand's revival after a series of food quality scandals. Rachel walked briskly towards Sarah, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, but her movements were hesitant, almost apologetic. She had been instructed to offer an immediate apology and to invite Sarah to a private waiting room to resolve the situation. But as Rachel approached, she knew that an apology, no matter how sincere, wouldn't be enough. She stopped a few feet away from Sarah and with a forced smile said, "Ms. Williams, I deeply apologize for this inconvenience. If you would allow me, I would like to invite you to a private waiting room where we can discuss this matter further." Sarah didn't flinch, nor did she acknowledge the apology with more than a polite nod. She had heard these words too many times before, words that were meant to smooth over mistakes but rarely led to any real change. Sarah knew that the apology wasn't enough. This wasn't just about an isolated incident. This wasn't about one overzealous gate agent or a miscommunication. This was about something far deeper, something ingrained in the company's culture. Sarah knew that this situation, while personal to her, was representative of a much larger systemic issue. It wasn't just about one individual's prejudice, it was about how that prejudice had been allowed to masquerade as protocol and how JetStream had failed to address it despite their commitment to reform. "No, Rachel," Sarah said calmly, her voice cutting through the tension. "I don't want your apology. I want action." Rachel's face tightened, but she said nothing, waiting for Sarah to continue. "This isn't just a mistake made by one employee." Sarah continued, her gaze steady and unwavering. "This is a reflection of the system in place at JetStream. It's an example of how prejudice disguised as procedure is allowed to thrive. You can apologize all you want, but what does it really mean if you don't fix the root of the problem?" Rachel shifted on her feet, looking down for a moment. She could feel the weight of Sarah's words, and for the first time in her career, she felt the gravity of what was at stake. Apologies, she realized, were just words. Real change required more than just saying, "sorry." It required confronting the culture of bias that had been allowed to fester unchecked in their operations. She had been so focused on managing the brand's image and keeping the wheels of the company moving smoothly that she had failed to see the cracks beneath the surface. And now, standing before Sarah, she realized that it was time to confront those cracks head-on. "I understand, Ms. Williams." Rachel replied, her voice quieter now, tinged with a sense of sincerity that hadn't been there before. "I will do whatever it takes to make this right, but I need you to know that we are committed to making changes." Sarah's eyes softened just slightly, but her expression remained firm. "It's not about promises, Rachel," she said. "It's about accountability. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again, not just to me, but to anyone else who doesn't fit the mold you've created in your mind of what a first-class passenger should look like. It's about rethinking how your staff interacts with passengers and how you train them to recognize bias in their actions." Rachel nodded, her lips pressing together in a thin line. She knew Sarah was right. The airline's reputation had been carefully crafted over the years, but it was built on the wrong foundation. JetStream had taken great pride in its efforts to repair its public image after the food scandals, but it had failed to address the more insidious issues that lay just beneath the surface. This was bigger than a single incident. It was a wake-up call, I promise you, Miss Williams. Rachel said, her voice now steadier. We will take immediate action. I'll begin the process of reviewing the policies and procedures that led to this, and I'll ensure that all frontline staff undergo training to recognize and address bias, both in their actions and in their perceptions. This isn't just about fixing a mistake. It's about changing the culture of our company from the inside out. Sarah listened quietly, but her gaze didn't soften. Good, she replied. That's what I want to hear. This can't be just about saving face. It needs to be about real, tangible change. You're not just changing how your employees interact with passengers. You're changing how JetStream will be perceived in the future. If you want to truly be a leader in this industry, you need to lead by example. You need to show the world that you understand the systemic issues that affect people like me, people who have fought to be seen, to be heard, and to be respected. The silence that followed felt heavy. Rachel took a deep breath, realizing that this conversation was far from over. The wheels of change had started turning, but it would take more than a few promises to make a difference. Sarah wasn't looking for recognition. She wasn't interested in being lauded as a trailblazer or a hero. She just wanted accountability. She wanted to see the systemic issues that had led to this incident addressed in a meaningful way. And Rachel, for the first time in a long while, realized that this was a moment that could define her leadership, one that could either reinforce the status quo or begin to rebuild the company's values from the ground up. I won't let this slide. Rachel Sarah said, her voice low but firm. I'm not asking for public recognition, and I'm not asking for a thank you note. I'm asking for action. I want to know that from this moment forward, you're going to make sure that the next person who walks through your doors, regardless of how they look or what they wear, won't be treated like I was today. Rachel nodded, the weight of her responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. Understood. I'll make sure this is the last time anything like this happens at JetStream. For a moment, there was nothing more to say. Sarah looked at Rachel, then at the security guard who had been standing silently by her side, and finally at the crowd of passengers who had been watching the scene unfold. She had made her point, and now it was time to move on. She wasn't interested in holding grudges or demanding apologies from those who didn't understand. What mattered now was that the system would change, and in that moment, she knew she had done what was necessary. With a calm nod, Sarah turned toward the gate, her back straight, her gaze unwavering as she walked past Rachel and the security guard. She didn't look back. She had nothing left to prove. Her silence had already done the talking, and as she entered the private waiting room, she knew that JetStream Airlines would never look at its passengers the same way again. The morning of Sarah Williams' encounter at Gate 17 felt like an eternity in the airport's chaotic world. But what was just a brief moment of personal injustice would soon spiral far beyond the boundaries of JFK Airport. Sarah had unknowingly set in motion a sequence of events that would not only reshape her own life, but the entire landscape of JetStream Airlines. As the hours passed, the story spread like wildfire across social media, carried by the sharp-eyed passengers who had witnessed the standoff. What had begun as an isolated incident of racial bias quickly turned into a viral sensation, with hundreds of posts, tweets, and hashtags circulating the internet, all centered around the hashtag #Gate17Fail. By the time Sarah's flight had landed in San Francisco, the ripple effects of the incident had already reached JetStream's headquarters. The internal crisis management teams were in full swing, working to contain the growing backlash. JetStream's social media accounts were flooded with responses, and media outlets began reaching out for statements. But it wasn't just public relations that was scrambling. The true gravity of what had transpired had finally sunk in with the executives at JetStream Airlines. The incident wasn't just about one gate agent's mistake or an isolated customer service failure. It was a reflection of a deeper systemic issue that was embedded in their operations, a prejudice that had been lurking unnoticed in their corporate culture for far too long. The company's leadership knew they had to act, and they had to act fast. By the following morning, JetStream had announced an immediate overhaul of their training policies, focusing on recognizing and addressing bias among all frontline employees. The airline's leadership publicly acknowledged that the actions of Emily Carter, the gate agent who had detained Sarah, were not just a mistake, but a glaring example of how unconscious bias could be embedded in everyday interactions. In response, JetStream pledged to implement company-wide bias training with a particular focus on customer service teams at airports, flight attendants, and even senior executives. The airline had promised to begin a series of workshops and seminars on racial bias, making sure that all staff members were educated on the impacts of prejudice and how to recognize and address it in their daily roles. The changes, however, weren't just confined to JetStream Airlines. As the incident became a talking point across social media platforms, it sparked a broader conversation within the airline industry, one that had long been ignored. Other companies in the industry began re-examining their own policies, prompting discussions about systemic racism, racial bias in customer service, and how airlines treated their passengers based on appearance. What had once been seen as an isolated incident in the airline world was now recognized as part of a larger, more pervasive issue. The conversation quickly spread beyond the walls of JetStream and airports worldwide, igniting debates on LinkedIn, Twitter, and industry blogs. Was it possible that racial bias had been so deeply ingrained in the industry that it affected how customers were treated? Were airlines inadvertently training their staff to make snap judgments based on skin color and attire? For Sarah Williams, the wave of recognition and praise that followed didn't interest her. In fact, it almost seemed out of place. She wasn't a public figure, and she certainly hadn't asked for her actions to be celebrated. She had never intended to be the face of a movement, nor did she need her name in the headlines. What mattered to Sarah wasn't the accolades or the recognition from strangers. It was the change she had sparked, the quiet, forceful acknowledgement that the world had a responsibility to confront bias head-on. Sarah had always believed that the most effective way to fight injustice was not with loud speeches or inflammatory declarations, but with quiet, resolute action. And that was exactly what she had done at Gate 17. She had used her silence, her presence, and her unwavering confidence to challenge the deeply ingrained bias in a company that until that moment had failed to acknowledge its own flaws. As the days passed, Sarah returned to her work with Fresh Farms, Supply Her Company, now in the midst of a whirlwind of business meetings and contract negotiations. But even as the media stories continued to flood in, she kept her focus on her company's mission, providing clean, sustainable, and fresh food to the masses. She didn't allow herself to be distracted by the attention or the newfound status as a symbol of resilience. Instead, she chose to quietly continue her work, knowing that her actions had spoken volumes. It wasn't about how many people knew her name or how many articles were written about her. What mattered was that she had done the right thing and that JetStream Airlines was now rethinking its policies. It was a victory not for Sarah's reputation, but for the people who would never have to face the same bias again. The most powerful moments often come without fanfare or applause. Sarah didn't need anyone to celebrate her. She knew that the true impact of her actions would be felt not in the immediate aftermath, but in the long-term changes that would ripple out from this one small moment of confrontation. Sarah's insistence on accountability had not just altered the course of her day, it had set the foundation for a broader shift in the way customers would be treated at JetStream and beyond. By standing still, by simply not reacting with the anger that many would have felt in her shoes, Sarah had forced a powerful system to acknowledge its own flaws and to begin the process of healing them. As Sarah boarded the flight back home, her first-class seat waiting for her, she knew that her role in the transformation at JetStream Airlines wasn't over yet, But for now, she could rest, knowing that the change she had initiated was already making waves. The company had heard her. The industry had heard her. And now it was up to them to make sure this lesson didn't go unnoticed. For Sarah, that was enough. As the plane ascended into the sky, she closed her eyes and let out a deep breath, knowing that the impact of this moment would reverberate far beyond the walls of the airport, far beyond the boardrooms of corporate America, and into the hearts of those who understood that change begins with action, not words. If you found Sarah's story impactful, make sure to subscribe to Deep Inside HQ for more stories of courage, resilience, and real change. We bring you the most inspiring tales that challenge the status quo and highlight the power of standing up for what's right. Don't miss out. Hit the notification bell and share this video to spread the message of accountability and the importance of confronting prejudice in our society. Join the conversation and be a part of the change.